Chapter 1. Introduction. The End is Approaching. In the spring of 1945, Europe lay in ruins. The Second World War, unleashed by Nazi Germany in September 1939, was approaching its bitter climax. After 6 years of unimaginable violence, after millions of deaths, destroyed cities, and torn societies, it was clear that the Third Reich was facing its final demise. The Allies had turned the tide on all fronts, and the territory of the Reich was besieged from the east as well as from the west. Berlin, the heart of the Nazi dictatorship, was not only the capital of a dying state in those weeks, but also the last symbol of the resistance of a leadership that had long since lost sight of reality and reason. In the streets, there was an eerie mixture of resignation, fanatical perseverance, and naked fear of what was to come. The population of Berlin at that time consisted of a mixture of old people, women, children, and scattered soldiers. Many men of fighting age had fallen, been taken prisoner, or were still deployed on distant fronts. At the same time, refugee treks from the east crowded into the city. People who wanted to escape the advance of the Red Army and yet ran straight into the coming pocket. Nazi propaganda continued to paint the picture of the final victory. Slogans of perseverance were painted on walls, read out in radio speeches, and printed in the last editions of the Volkssturm after. But the reality was different. Berlin was no longer the shining metropolis of the 1920s, nor was it the upgraded capital of the Nazi era. Factories were at a standstill or only produced provisionally. Local transport was severely restricted. Food became a scarce commodity. Power outages were commonplace. Hunger gnawed at the population, and the fear of bombing and artillery strikes grew from day to day. In April 1945, the situation came to a head dramatically. While American, British, and French troops crossed the territory of the Reich from the west, the Red Army was ready to fight the last great battle of the war in the east, the Battle of Berlin. For Stalin, the capture of the German capital was not only a military goal, but also of immense political importance. It was intended to seal the victory of the Soviet Union over National Socialism and, at the same time, underline its claim to power in post-war Europe. Thus began the last and, at the same time, most brutal battle on European soil. Berlin became the scene of an apocalyptic final battle in which hundreds of thousands were to lose their lives. Soldiers and civilians alike were swept into the maelstrom. Between the ruins of the imperial capital, the fate of Germany, and the final decision of the Second World War in Europe were to take place in a few weeks. This chapter marks the beginning of a detailed journey through the last days of the Third Reich. It is an attempt not only to describe military processes, but also to make the voices of the people audible who, in the midst of bombs, grenades, fear, and hope, went their last way to catastrophe. Chapter 2. The Road to Berlin. Strategic Initial Situation in 1945. When the year 1945 began, the downfall of National Socialist Germany was already foreseeable. On all fronts, the Allies were deep in the territory of the Reich, and the military situation left no room for illusions. The Wehrmacht was exhausted after years of total war, bled dry in terms of material and personnel. Entire divisions existed only on paper, while the Allied forces advanced inexorably. Especially in the east, the Red Army had developed a force that could hardly be stopped by the German side. Since the catastrophic defeat in Stalingrad in 1943, the situation at the front had deteriorated continuously. The Soviet troops advanced inexorably westwards in a series of offensives. Every German defensive battle, whether at Kursk or in Belarus, ended in heavy losses and further retreats. Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944 had finally smashed Army Group Center, one of the strongest German front formations, and thus opened the door to Poland. In a very short time, the Germans lost large territories, and the front moved inexorably towards the Oder. The Western Front presented a similar picture. After the successful landing of the Allies in Normandy in June 1944, the collapse began here as well. Although Hitler tried to turn the tide again with the Battle of the Bulge in December of the same year, the last major attack in the West failed. The losses were devastating, and the Wehrmacht had gambled away the last reserves. From now on, the Western Allies, supported by superior air forces, were on their way to the German heartland. In the spring of 1945, Germany was thus caught in a pincer from two sides. From the west, American, British, and French troops advanced deep into the territory of the Reich, had crossed the Rhine, and were approaching the Ruhr area. In the east, the Red Army gathered its forces for the decisive blow against Berlin. It was only a matter of time before the two fronts would meet. For Stalin, the capture of Berlin was of the utmost importance. Although the Western Allies had the opportunity to advance more quickly into the capital after their advance into the Reich, the conquest of the imperial capital was not allowed to fall into American or British hands, both politically and symbolically. The Soviet Union had borne the brunt of the war against Germany, losing millions of soldiers and civilians, and Stalin wanted to ensure that history would inextricably link the final victory to the Red Army. A Soviet banner on the Reichstag was intended to symbolize not only the triumph over National Socialism, but also the future order in Europe. Hitler, on the other hand, clung to his fantasies of final victory despite the hopeless situation. In the last months before the Battle of Berlin, he indulged in unrealistic orders and orders that were hardly feasible. He believed in the use of so-called miracle weapons that could still turn the tide of the war, and forbade strategic retreats that could possibly have saved lives. His orders were often marked by a loss of reality and anger. He moved entire divisions back and forth on maps, even though they had long since ceased to exist. In 1945, the Wehrmacht itself was only a shadow of its former strength. Armored divisions sometimes had little more than a dozen roadworthy vehicles, and soldiers were poorly equipped, poorly cared for, and mentally and physically exhausted. Reinforcements were formed from Volkssturm units consisting of old men, young people, and war invalids. They received weapons in a hurry, often obsolete material from the First World War, and were supposed to do the impossible at the fronts. Berlin itself could hardly be defended militarily. The city was already badly destroyed by the Allied air raids, industrial plants lay in ruins, the railway network was badly damaged. Armaments production collapsed, and the few soldiers still fit for action were hastily ordered to the front. Nevertheless, Hitler declared Berlin a fortress and demanded that the city be held at all costs. For the population, the strategic location was unmistakable. The news, as distorted as it was by the propaganda, left no doubt. The war was lost. Those who still wanted to hope did so out of desperation, fear, or blind faith in the Führer. Many Berliners tried to console themselves with the thought that the Western Allies might reach the city faster than the Soviets. The fear of the Red Army was deeply rooted, nourished by reports of atrocities in East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania. This fear drove refugees west in endless treks, many of them finally ending up in Berlin because all escape routes were cut off. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Soviet leadership was systematically preparing for the final offensive. Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konev, two of the most experienced commanders of the Red Army, were given the order to take the city. Their armies included millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and a huge logistical machine. The advance had been planned well in advance, and Stalin himself followed the operation with the utmost attention. The Western Allies, especially Eisenhower, deliberately decided against a quick advance on Berlin. It was clear to them that the cost of human lives would have been extremely high, and politically, they had already agreed with Stalin at the Yalta and Tehran conferences that the Soviet sphere of influence should extend to Berlin. For the Americans and British, it was more important to end the war as quickly as possible while keeping their own losses low. Instead of advancing on Berlin, they concentrated on occupying the rest of Germany and capturing as many war criminals as possible. Thus, in April 1945, it was almost inevitable that the conquest of Berlin would be the task of the Red Army. The city became a strategic target to be taken by all means. For Stalin, it was a race against time, not only against the Western Allies, but also between his own generals, both of whom wanted to claim glory. Zhukov and Konev competed to see who would be the first to move into Berlin. This competition led to even more aggressive advances, which increased the pace, but also increased losses on the Soviet side. When the front reached the Oder at the beginning of April, the last bastion before Berlin had been reached. The German army group Vistula, composed of remnants of various formations, was ready to defend the capital at all costs. But the balance of power was clear. On the Soviet side, there were around 2.5 million soldiers, over 6,000 tanks, and more than 40,000 guns. The Germans had only a handful of combat-capable divisions, a lack of equipment, and hardly any air support. The Luftwaffe was practically non-existent. The strategic situation in the spring of 1945 can therefore be reduced to a common denominator. The war was decided, but the last battle was still to come. For the German leadership, it was a matter of desperately delaying the inevitable. For the Soviets, it was about the ultimate victory and the political shaping of the post-war order. Berlin was more than just a city. It was the symbol, trophy, and goal of one of the bloodiest battles in human history.
Chapter 3: The Red Army Advances. In April 1945, the Red Army struck a decisive blow, and for weeks the Soviet generals had concentrated their forces, gathered material, and organized supplies. On the Oder, not far from Berlin, there were huge formations that were just waiting to strike the German capital like a clenched fist. The dimension of this preparation went beyond imagination. More than 2 million soldiers were ready, supported by thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of guns, and an air fleet that finally dominated the German Luftwaffe, which was already on the ground. It was clear to the Soviet leadership that this last offensive had to be not only militarily successful, but also a political signal. The days before the attack were marked by restless tension. In the positions along the Oder, the Soviet soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder. Many of them had years of fighting behind them, had survived the horrors of Stalingrad, Kursk, or Leningrad, and had deep scars on their bodies and souls. Now they were on the verge of carrying the war back to its place of origin. There was a mixture of pride, relief, and unbridled anger in the sessions. For many, the March on Berlin was not only a military mission, but also a personal revenge for the agony they had suffered, for burned villages, for murdered family members. Soviet propaganda had deliberately reinforced this mood. In the newspapers and radio reports, it was repeatedly emphasized that the Red Army was not only fighting to defeat fascism, but to create justice for the victims. Stalin himself had issued the slogan that the flag of victory must fly over Berlin. It was not just one goal among many, but the ultimate symbol of triumph over Hitler and his regime. The German side watched this march with growing desperation. Army Group Vistula, which was to withstand the attack, consisted of severely decimated units whose combat power was hardly significant. Many soldiers were untrained recruits, others were already war-weary veterans. The equipment was inadequate, ammunition was scarce, and the tank stocks were ridiculously low compared to the Soviet superiority. While the Soviet divisions had new T-34s and the IS-2 heavy tanks, the Germans often had to make do with outdated vehicles or even without armored support. On April 16, 1945, the offensive began. With artillery fire that turned night into day, the Red Army opened the Battle of Berlin. Thousands of guns fired at the same time. Entire regions were enveloped in an inferno of fire and smoke. Contemporary witnesses later reported that the ground shook as if an earthquake shook the landscape. The noise was deafening, and even several kilometers behind the front line, the thunder of the cannons could be heard. For the German soldiers in the positions on the Oder, this was the harbinger of a catastrophe that they could no longer avert. After the hail of artillery, the Soviet infantry units started moving. Supported by tanks and assault guns, an unstoppable mass rolled westwards. The first attacks hit the Seelow heights, a last line of defense before Berlin. There, the Germans had strengthened their positions and hoped to delay the advance at least for a few days. General Gotthard Heinrichs, one of the most capable German commanders, had tried to make the defense as effective as possible by withdrawing his troops and not letting them be crushed in the first Soviet barrage. Nevertheless, it was clear that this defense could only be a postponement. Soviet losses in the first days of the offensive were high. The attack on the Seelow heights turned into a bloody material battle. Tanks got stuck in the swampy ground, infantry met with stubborn resistance, and the Germans used every elevation to take the attackers under fire. But the sheer mass of the Red Army left no doubt about the outcome. While the Germans fought for every position, new Soviet units rolled incessantly. In the days that followed, the situation worsened dramatically. The Soviet marshals Zhukov and Konev competed to see who would reach Berlin first. Stalin had tasked both with the conquest of the city, and so both fronts pushed westwards with maximum effort. This race led to the attacks being even more merciless. The soldiers were sent forward incessantly, losses were hardly noticed. For the Red Army, it was a fight by hook or by crook, which was not only based on military, but also on the personal ambition of the generals. Meanwhile, news of the Soviet advance spread like wildfire in Berlin itself. The civilian population lived between fear and hope. Some clung to the idea that the Western Allies might be able to reach the city before the Soviets. But the reality became clearer with each passing day. The Red Army was only a few dozen kilometers away, and its vanguards were already breaking through the German lines. The refugees who had poured into the city from the eastern regions told of atrocities, burning cities, and violence they had experienced on their way. These reports fueled the panic. Food was being hoarded in many basements, and people were trying to prepare for the siege. But what could a family do when millions of soldiers were approaching with tanks and guns? For the German soldiers at the front, the advance of the Red Army was a superior force against which any resistance seemed to be in vain. But they fought anyway, out of a sense of duty, out of fear of punishment, out of conviction, or simply because there was no way out. The Red Army, on the other hand, was moving closer to Berlin day by day. Their tank units finally broke through the German positions on the Seelow heights, despite the high losses. The road to Berlin was open, and the Soviet troops began to encircle the suburbs. The pressure on the German capital grew with every hour. The offensive also showed the full force of modern warfare. Artillery and tanks rolled through the landscape, while the air forces dominated the skies. The German villages and towns along the march route were reduced to rubble. Those who did not flee were at the mercy of death. For the civilian population, the Soviet advance did not mean liberation, but often destruction and violence. So the Red Army advanced in a huge stream towards Berlin. Within a few days, the distance between the front lines and the imperial capital shrank dramatically. While Zhukov's troops were pushing from the northeast, Konev's units were moving in from the south. Berlin became the center of a huge cauldron that closed inexorably. At the end of the third week of April, it was clear that the downfall was only a matter of days. Berlin was about to be under siege, and the Red Army was preparing to storm the city. Millions of soldiers looked towards the capital, which for them was the final target of a cruel and endless war.
Chapter 4. Everyday Life in the Besieged City. Berlin in April 1945 was a city that was hardly recognizable. Only a shadow remained of the once vibrant metropolis, which was home to almost 4.5 million people before the war. Large parts of the city lay in ruins, caused by years of Allied air raids. Entire streets were burned out. The silhouette of the capital was characterized by ruins, shattered windows, and smoking mountains of rubble. But despite this destruction, millions of people still lived in Berlin. Women,
children, old people, soldiers on home leave, refugees, and all those who had not found a way out. The everyday life of these people was determined by deprivation, fear, and paralyzing insecurity. The supply of food had long since collapsed. Strict rationing had been in place for years, but in the last months of the war, the stamps were hardly worth the paper they were printed on. Bread became increasingly scarce, meat was almost unavailable, and the few potatoes that were given out were barely enough to survive. Many Berliners searched for food in the rubble, cooked soups from beets or watery leftovers, and tried to find fuel somewhere. Hunger gnawed at everyone, and children in particular suffered from it. In addition to food shortages, fear was a constant companion. For months, Soviet troops had been within range of the capital, and the residents knew that the battle for the city was imminent. For years, propaganda had painted a horrific picture of the Red Army: looting, massacres, rapes. Stories about the events in East Prussia and Silesia, where the Red Army had first penetrated, spread like wildfire. Refugees reported burning villages, acts of violence that could hardly be surpassed in cruelty. Whether these reports were exaggerated or real mattered little. They fueled panic and reinforced the idea that the Red Army's invasion would spell the end of all order and security. But while the fear grew, life went on, somehow. People sought shelter in basements and air raid shelters as soon as the siren sounded. Although the Allied air raids had decreased in intensity as the city was already largely destroyed, the Red Army's artillery was already beginning to shell the eastern districts. Grenades hit residential buildings, trams derailed, and fires broke out. Many Berliners spent nights in stuffy basements, crowded between neighbors, refugees, and strangers, while the impacts could be heard above them. Despite the catastrophic situation, the National Socialist leadership stuck to its slogans of perseverance. Posters with the order, "Berlin is defended," were emblazoned on the walls that were still standing. Newspapers and radio claimed that the city had been declared a fortress and would never fall into enemy hands. Anyone who expressed doubts or even talked about surrender risked being denounced or arrested. The Gestapo and the last remnants of the SS ensured that the population remained in fear and obedience. Executions on the open street were not uncommon. Men who refused to serve in the Volkssturm were executed as Wehrkraftsversetzer, often hung from lampposts as a deterrent. The Volkssturm itself was a tragic symbol of the state of the city. Old men, teenage boys, and war invalids were given rifles or rocket-propelled grenades and were supposed to defend the capital. Many of these fighters had hardly any training. Some did not even know how to operate a rifle properly. Nevertheless, they were put into uniforms, sometimes in old pieces from the First World War, and assigned to guard duty on street corners. For the civilian population, the sight of children in uniform handling bazookas that were far too heavy was a harrowing sight. The Hitler Youth also played an uncanny role in those days. While many young people had long since had no illusions, there were still fanatically indoctrinated people who were willing to fight to the last. They were celebrated as heroes by propaganda and were supposed to serve as a role model for the rest of the population. At the same time, most adults knew that it was a crime to send children into a hopeless battle. Everyday life in Berlin was a life between ruins. Water pipes were damaged. Power outages were the order of the day. Those who still lived in halfway intact apartments had to improvise in order to have warmth and light. Candles and kerosene were rare, and many tried to burn wood from rubble or furniture. Entire parks were cut down to obtain fuel. Trams hardly ran anymore, and even bicycles became a valuable means of transport. People sought support in routines, as fragile as they were. Some schools still tried to hold classes until the fighting was just around the corner. Churches were places of contact for prayers, hope, and sometimes also a piece of community. Others sought distraction in small gestures, a song sung in the basement, a piece of bread shared with neighbors. But above all, there was the certainty that the war was entering its final and cruelest phase.
Particularly depressing was the presence of the refugees who had come to the city from the eastern areas. They had fled with handcarts, bicycles, or simply on foot, carrying belongings in bundles on their backs. Many found shelter with relatives or strangers, often in cellars that were already overcrowded. Their reports increased the panic, and at the same time, they put even more strain on the already scarce resources. Hunger, cold, and confinement became unbearable for everyone. The last shops in the city hardly offered anything. The shop windows were empty, and those who were lucky found a piece of bread or a few potatoes on the black market. Payment was made with jewelry, clothing, or anything that still had any value. Money itself had become almost meaningless. Many Berliners exchanged belongings for food, and so watches, rings, and family heirlooms changed hands while the shells hit outside. While the civilian population tried to survive, the German leadership in the city prepared for the final battle. In the center of Berlin, in the government district, the Führerbunker had been further expanded. Hitler resided there, sealed off from reality. His orders sounded more and more grotesque, but they had a direct impact on the people of the city. Anyone who refused to fight was considered a traitor. Anyone who expressed doubts risked death. In April 1945, Berliners lived in an atmosphere of fear, hunger, and coercion. The days were marked by impacts, panic rumors, coercive measures, and paralyzing waiting. Everyone knew that the battle was coming. Everyone heard the artillery on the horizon. And yet people tried to hold on to the small remnants of everyday life. It was the life of a city that was in the shadow of its own demise.
Chapter 5. The German Leadership Between Hope and Doom. While the population of Berlin lived in fear and hunger, another, no less dramatic spectacle played out in the centers of power. The German leadership, above all Adolf Hitler, had long since lost touch with reality. In the underground bunker in Wilhelmstrasse, a world prevailed that was fundamentally different from the streets of the capital. While shells fell above and people crouched in cellars, plans were still being made in the stuffy rooms of the Führerbunker, as if the war could be turned around with orders on maps. Adolf Hitler was a broken man at that time. The former dictator, who had brought Europe to its knees with a blitzkrieg-like advance, was now a leader marked by illness and paranoia. Eyewitness reports describe him as physically frail, with trembling hands, a hunched posture, and repeatedly haunted by tantrums. But even when his body deteriorated, he rigidly clung to his visions of the final victory. For him, capitulation was not an option. Berlin was to become a fortress that would be defended to the last man. Any doubt about this order was considered treason. A circle of followers gathered around Hitler who continued to be attached to him for various reasons. Some were fanatical National Socialists who really believed that the tide could still turn. Others were opportunists who wanted to hold on to their position of power until the end. Still others were simply afraid of Hitler's wrath, afraid of the SS, afraid of the chaos that would ensue after an open rupture. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, embodied the most fanatical loyalty in those days. With his speeches and slogans, he tried to maintain the perseverance of the population. He himself was convinced that Germany must either win or perish in a heroic downfall. His faith in the Führer was unshakable, and he staged himself as the last fighter at Hitler's side. For Goebbels it was clear, if Berlin falls, he falls too. Others, such as Hermann Goering and Heinrich Himmler, on the other hand, began to seek their own ways behind the scenes. Goering, once the powerful commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, had long since fallen out of favor. His troops were practically destroyed, and he himself had entrenched himself in his possessions in Bavaria. When defeat became apparent, he tried to seize power by means of a telegram, invoking the succession arrangements in the event of Hitler's inability to act. However, this step only led to Hitler cursing him as a traitor.
Himmler, on the other hand, head of the SS and one of the most powerful men in the regime, secretly sounded out possibilities for peace with the Western Allies. He had contacts made through intermediaries in the hope of saving at least part of the Reich from Soviet occupation. But these attempts failed miserably. For the Western powers, it was clear that there would be no separate negotiations with the Nazi socialists, and Stalin demanded unconditional loyalty. Himmler thus became a symbol of the disintegration of the Nazi leadership, which in recent days has been more concerned with internal power games than with a realistic solution to the fate of the country. In the Reichskanzlei and in the Führerbunker, there was an atmosphere of mistrust and isolation. Hitler trusted only a few, and even they were worn down by his capriciousness and his loss of reality. His briefings were marked by outbursts of anger, accusations, and illusory orders. He moved divisions to maps that had long since disappeared, and ordered counteroffensives for which there were no more soldiers and fuel. His generals hardly dared to tell him the truth. Anyone who spoke too honestly risked being immediately dismissed or worse. Despite this blindness, there were some in the military leadership who tried to at least delay the downfall. Colonel General Gotthard Heinrichi, for example, who organized the defense of the Oder Line, did what he could to stop the Red Army. But he knew that it could only be a postponement. Other commanders, such as General Weidling, who would later take command of the defense of Berlin, were caught between a sense of duty and the realization that the situation was hopeless. The tensions within the leadership grew with each passing day. While Hitler appealed to his last loyalists to defend Berlin to the utmost, others had long been looking for ways out. There was discussion about whether Hitler should leave the city and retreat to the Alps, where an Alpine fortress was supposedly being prepared. But Hitler refused. He declared that he would not leave Berlin, that he would stay in the capital and, if necessary, seek death. For the population, this behavior was incomprehensible. While they starved and died, while houses collapsed and families were torn apart, the leadership lived in bunkers, protected from the immediate violence of war. The discrepancy between the reality on the streets and the perseverance slogans from the law firm could hardly be greater. Goebbels had leaflets and radio reports circulated that reported on alleged counteroffensives. There was talk of new weapons that were about to be deployed, of armies that would throw back the Red Army in a few days. But people had long since stopped believing it. They heard the thunder of Soviet artillery. They saw the front approaching every day. The belief in a Turnham had long since been extinguished. With every day that the Red Army approached, the inner conflict of the leadership became clearer. The men around Hitler vacillated between fanatical loyalty, opportunism, and naked fear of their own responsibility. Some, such as Goebbels and Bormann, clung to him until the bitter end. Others tried to get to safety or negotiate deals. This split reflected the state of the entire regime, a system that collapsed but whose leader was unable to accept reality. Hitler himself withdrew deeper and deeper into his own world. His monologues in the bunker were about betrayal, about the cowardice of the generals, about the alleged failure of the German people. He blamed everyone but himself. For him, the war was not lost because his strategy was wrong, but because the German people were not strong enough. These thoughts revealed how far he had distanced himself from reality. Thus, in the last few days, two worlds have faced each other. On the outside, the chaos, the hunger, the despair of the population. Inside, the leadership which was trapped in intrigues, illusions, and fanatical blindness. Hope and doom merged into a sinister web that characterized the last weeks of Nazi rule. Berlin became the stage for a downfall that the leadership did not want to prevent and could not prevent.
Chapter 6. First Advances into the Suburbs. When the battles on the Seelow Heights were decided and the Soviet troops had forced a breakthrough across the Oder, the way to Berlin was clear. After only a few days, the Red Army's vanguards advanced into the outer districts of the capital. For the inhabitants of the suburbs, this began a phase of horror that surpassed anything they had experienced in previous years through bombing raids. War was no longer a distant thunder on the horizon, it was now literally on the doorstep. The first Soviet units reached the eastern outskirts of Berlin in mid-April 1945, and Strausberg, Hoppegarten, Mausdorf, and other places on the outskirts of the capital became focal points of fierce fighting. In these districts, which still had some intact houses and infrastructure, the German defenders tried to stop the attackers. But the balance of power was clear. While the Germans brought together makeshift units of Volkssturm, remnants of Wehrmacht divisions, and Hitler Youth into position, tank columns rolled in on the Soviet side, supported by artillery and infantry, which systematically took house after house. For the civilian population, the advance of the Red Army meant a catastrophe. Many had hoped to flee to the west in time, but the streets were overcrowded or already cut off by Soviet units. Entire families wandered through the streets, sought shelter in cellars or cellar shafts, and heard the crack of the guns coming closer and closer. The fear of looting, violence, and rape was omnipresent, and often this fear was confirmed in a cruel way. Contemporary witnesses report chaotic scenes. Doors were broken open, people were dragged out of their homes, women were abused, while tanks rolled through the streets in the background. The German defenders tried to delay the advance. Barricades were erected in streets, bazookas were handed out to young people, and every street became an improvised fortress. But the superiority was overwhelming. As soon as resistance arose, the Red Army used massive artillery fire, which brought down houses and wiped out entire streets. The resistance was brave, but at the same time pointless. The Soviet war machine could not be stopped. The battles for the eastern districts, such as Lichtenberg and Marzahn, were particularly dramatic. Here, the first Soviet divisions met fierce resistance, which, however, could only delay the advance by hours or days. Entire streets changed hands several times. First, Soviet units stormed the houses. Then, German soldiers tried to beat them back with rocket-propelled grenades and grenadades. But as soon as the Soviet commanders brought in more forces, the situation inevitably tipped. The way the Red Army proceeded showed a clear strategy. They did not want to take Berlin with a single, all-important attack, but to systematically encircle the city. While the first units took control of the eastern suburbs, other units advanced from the south and north so that Berlin was gradually surrounded by an iron ring. Each breakthrough led to the city being more closely enclosed. After just a few days, it was clear that Berlin was militarily isolated. The German leadership reacted to these developments with a mixture of fanaticism and despair. Hitler ordered that every part of the city had to be defended to the last man. No house, no bridge, no place should be given up without a fight. These orders led to even hopeless battles being fought, in which entire streets were reduced to rubble and ashes without the strategic situation improving in the slightest. For the civilians, this was a double fate. They were crushed between the fronts and had hardly any opportunities to escape the fighting. While the Soviet tanks rolled into the eastern suburbs, the population in the inner districts prepared for the inevitable. Rumors about the actions of the Red Army spread like wildfire. Reports of massacres and acts of violence in the comfort suburbs led to panic. Many women tried to hide or sought shelter in churches, hospitals, or basements, hoping to be spared there. But even these refuges offered no guarantee. The first advances of the Red Army were characterized by a merciless harshness. For many Soviet soldiers, this was the culmination of a years-long campaign. They had seen their homelands burn, lost their families, and now they stood in the heart of the country that had done all this. This mixture of revenge, hatred, and the permission of their own leadership to show no mercy led to chaos that was hardly bearable for the civilian population. At the same time, however, the other side also showed itself. Some soldiers behaved correctly, sharing bread or helping the wounded. There were officers who prohibited looting or prevented acts of violence. But in the crowd and under the conditions of a fierce final battle, it was impossible to guarantee order. Berlin had become a battlefield on which morality and humanity often had no place. The suburbs were transformed into an apocalyptic scene within a few days. Streets were littered with rubble, tank wrecks, and the corpses of soldiers and civilians. Smoke hung over the city, and the night was lit up by the firelight. Every step to the west brought the Red Army closer to the center, while the Germans desperately tried to delay the advance. But fate was sealed. In the basements of the suburbs, people lived in constant fear. The crash of rifle volleys, the roar of the tanks, and the roar of the artillery made the ground tremble. Children screamed, mothers tried to calm down, while men went out with bazookas and often didn't return. Life took place in a few square meters between moisture, darkness, and the constant fear of being discovered or buried. Thus, the first advances of the Red Army on the suburbs marked the beginning of the actual battle for Berlin. From now on, the city was no longer just the symbol of doom, but the battlefield itself. Every district, every street, every house was to become part of this gigantic struggle in the coming days. For the residents, it meant that war had finally come to them, no longer from afar, no longer through the thunder of bombs, but right on their doorstep with all its brutality and inevitability.
Chapter 7. The Battle for the Heights of Seelow. The Battle of the Seelow Heights, which began on April 16, 1945, was the prelude to the fall of Berlin and is considered one of the bloodiest and most costly battles on German soil. It decided how quickly the Red Army would reach the capital of the Reich and how many days Berlin had left before it fell into the grip of Soviet troops. For the German side, this section of the front was of the utmost importance. Only here, about 70 kilometers east of Berlin, did the landscape offer a last natural line of defense. A plateau that rose gently but noticeably above the Oderbruch formed a ridge that was difficult to access, from which the German troops could take up favorable firing positions with a view of the lower-lying terrain. Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici, an experienced and sober commander, had the task of holding this line. Unlike many other generals in the last year of the war, Heinrici was not a fanatical National Socialist, but a realist who clearly recognized the hopelessness of the situation. But he tried to delay the inevitable by making his defense as effective as possible. He had his troops build deeply staggered positions, dig trenches, and lay minefields. He also ordered that the foremost positions be evacuated during the Soviet artillery bombardment in order to minimize losses from the first barrage. In doing so, he showed a shrewdness that was to cause considerable difficulties for the Soviets. When the Soviet offensive began on the morning of April 16th, the landscape east of Berlin was transformed into an inferno. More than 40,000 guns opened fire at the same time, plus rocket launchers and mortars. Night turned to day, the thunder could be heard for miles, and the ground shook under the force of the barrage. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who led the attack, hoped that this massive use of artillery would smash the German positions and clear the way for the tank units. But Heinrici's decision to evacuate the front lines shortly before the start of the fire saved the lives of many of his soldiers. When the Soviet infantry and tanks advanced after the shelling, they did not find the chaos they had expected, but a German defense that was still combat-ready. In addition, thick clouds of fog lay over the Oderbruch. This fog, combined with the smoke from artillery shelling, made it difficult for Soviet troops to identify their targets. Tanks faltered, infantry units lost their bearings, and the German defenders seized the opportunity to inflict massive losses among the attackers. In particular, the anti-tank guns, cleverly hidden in the slopes of the heights, caused severe damage to the Soviet T-34s. The fighting raged with relentless severity. Entire divisions of the Red Army threw themselves against the German lines, while Heinrici's troops desperately tried to defend every meter. German artillery shelled the jammed Soviet tank columns in the Oderbruch, turning the area into a deadly battlefield. But despite all the tactical skill, the superiority of the Red Army was overwhelming. New waves of soldiers and tanks followed, supported by an air force that dominated the skies. Zhukov himself came under increasing pressure. Stalin had made it clear that Berlin had to fall as quickly as possible, and Zhukov was in direct competition with Marshal Ivan Konev, who was advancing on the capital from the south. Every day of delay was not only a military problem for him, but also a question of his career and reputation. Seeing that the German lines held stronger than expected, he ordered even more massive attacks, regardless of the losses. Entire regiments were thrown into battle, often with little chance of returning alive from battle. For the Soviet soldiers, the Battle of the Seelow Heights was a nightmare. The Oderbruch had been transformed into a swampy, churned landscape by the shelling. Tanks sank into the morass, vehicles got stuck, and soldiers had to wade through knee-deep mud while German machine guns and artillery fired at them from the heights. Contemporary witnesses reported scenes in which entire units were wiped out within a few minutes. And yet, the Soviet commanders kept pushing forward. The German side fought with everything it could muster. In addition to regular Wehrmacht units, Volkssturm units were also deployed to hold out in the trenches. Boys with bazookas laid down on the streets to stop Soviet tanks. Some of these children did not even survive the first attack. But the severity of the resistance surprised the Soviet attackers and led to the Battle of the Seelow Heights lasting longer than Stalin had hoped. Despite the brave defense, the fate of the German troops was sealed. The Red Armies not only had numerical superiority, but inexhaustible logistics. While the Germans had to think about every shot, new ammunition trains and supply columns were constantly rolling in on the Soviet side. In addition, the Red Army ruthlessly used its air superiority. Bombardments smashed positions, and fighter bombers attacked German supply lines. After 3 days of relentless fighting, the German lines began to falter. The losses were high, the ammunition was almost used up, and the exhaustion was noticeable. Heinrich knew that the battle was lost, and he ordered an orderly retreat to save at least some of his units for the defense of Berlin. But this retreat was chaotic because the Soviet attackers pressed inexorably forward. Entire German units were encircled or wiped out, while the mass of the Red Army was finally able to overcome the heights. For the Red Army, victory was dearly bought. It is estimated that more than 30,000 people have been killed and wounded in these days alone. But the way to Berlin was now finally clear. Zhukov was able to continue the advance even though he knew he had to explain to Stalin why the capture of the heights had caused so many casualties. Nevertheless, the political pressure was so great that he had no choice but to send his soldiers in waves against the German lines. The Battle of the Seelow Heights once again showed the full tragedy of the war. On the one hand, an exhausted German army that tried with courage and tactical skill to delay the inevitable. On the other hand, an all-powerful Red Army that was prepared to accept countless sacrifices in the name of victory and revenge. For the civil population of Berlin, the fall of the Seelow Heights meant only one thing. The war, which many had endured for so long, had finally arrived on their doorstep. Chapter 8. Breakthrough to Berlin. After the costly struggle for the Seelow Heights, the way to Berlin was finally clear. Although Colonel General Heinrici had stopped the Soviet offensive for a few days with his skillful defense, the balance of power was too clear. The German lines were shattered, the troops exhausted and fragmented, and the Red Army continued to push forward with undiminished force. For the soldiers on both sides, the decisive phase now began, the march to the Reich's capital itself, where the fate of the war in Europe was to be decided. At that time, the landscape east of Berlin was a single field of rubble. Villages and small towns that had been shelled or bombed in the course of the fighting were in flames or lay in ruins. Fields were churned up by shells, streets littered with wrecked vehicles and corpses. The smell of smoke, powder, and death hung over everything. For the civilians who still lived in the villages and small towns, it was a nightmare. Those who had not fled had to experience how columns of tanks rolled through the streets, how houses were torn apart by artillery, and how the war marched mercilessly through their homeland. The Red Army advanced westwards in a huge stream. Millions of soldiers, accompanied by countless vehicles, cannons, and tanks, were moving towards Berlin. Despite the losses at the Seelow Heights, their fighting power was unbroken. Stalin demanded speed, and his marshals Zhukov and Konev delivered. Both pushed for Berlin, both wanted to claim the triumph for themselves. This race led to a merciless offensive, in which hardly any consideration was given to losses. For the soldiers on the front line, this meant a march through an inferno that left no room for breaks or rest. Meanwhile, the German defenders tried to slow down the advance as best they could, but they had hardly any funds left. The Wehrmacht had become a patchwork of assembled remnants. Volkssturm units and Hitler Youth supplemented the ranks where regular soldiers were missing. Tank stocks were minimal, and the Luftwaffe was practically non-existent. Many units fought to the last man, often for fear of the consequences if they backed down. But any resistance delayed the Soviet advance for hours at most, not for days. For the civilian population on the way to Berlin, the situation was catastrophic. Refugee treks heading west got caught between the fronts. Women, children, and old men moved over destroyed streets with handcarts and a few belongings, while shells fell above them. Again and again, these trains were run over by Soviet tanks or shot at by low-flying planes. Many who had hoped to escape to the west at the last minute were caught up and suddenly found themselves in the middle of the cauldron. The Soviet soldiers advanced rapidly into the outer districts of Berlin. The first units reached the eastern outskirts of the city as early as the end of April. House-to-house fighting broke out, which was to spread over the entire city in the coming days. Streets were turned into fortresses, every square into a battlefield. The Germans had laid booby traps, erected barricades, and distributed bazookas. They hoped to slow down the advance at least within the city and perhaps still create a way out for the leadership. But the reality was different. The ring around Berlin quickly closed. From the north, Soviet troops advanced via Oranienburg and Bernau, from the south via Königs Wusterhausen and Zossen, while from the east, the main forces advanced in Lichtenberg and Marzahn. Within a few days, the city was completely surrounded. Berlin was cut off from the outside world, surrounded by millions of Soviet soldiers. What happened now was a siege in the heart of Europe, a modern version of medieval encirclements, only with tanks, artillery, and bombs. The breakthrough into the city itself was accompanied by a horror that people could hardly put into words. Houses were shot down with artillery to break pockets of resistance. Tanks rolled over streets, while behind them, soldiers went from house to house, searching every room, checking every basement. Those who resisted were put down, but those who surrendered were often still not safe. The hatred felt by many Soviet soldiers erupted in acts of violence against civilians. Looting, rape, and shootings were commonplace. At the same time, the German leadership tried to artificially uphold the will to defend itself. Slogans of perseverance were circulated, and anyone who thought of surrendering was branded a traitor. Men and boys were still sent out onto the streets to attack Soviet tanks with rocket-propelled grenades. These attacks were often suicidal. Many young people died during their first missions without being able to seriously slow down the advance. The Red Army advanced relentlessly further into the city area. With each passing day, the German defensive ring shrank while the fighting became more intense. Streets became front lines, houses became fortresses, cellars became death traps. Berlin turned into a single battlefield in which life was hardly bearable. Civilians wandered through the ruins looking for water and food, while above their heads the roar of the guns never stopped. The Soviet leadership did everything in its power to complete the breakthrough as quickly as possible. Stalin did not want to delay the victory over Berlin, and the generals knew that every day was precious. Thus, the advance was pushed forward with brutal consistency. Entire districts were wiped out just to gain a few streets. The losses on both sides were high, but the outcome was beyond doubt. For the people of Berlin, the breakthrough of the Red Army was the final proof that there was no escape. The hope that the Western Allies could be faster was completely dashed. The noise of the cannons, the rattle of the tank tracks, the screams of the wounded, and the crash of collapsing buildings were unpresent. The war was no longer at the front. It was in every apartment, in every basement, in every street. Thus, with the breakthrough to Berlin, the last phase of the Second World War in Europe began. The city was besieged, the fighting raged in its streets, and the population was at the center of an apocalyptic final battle. The downfall of the Third Reich had become inevitable. It was only a matter of days before the last scenes of a war that had cost millions of lives and now found its cruel finale in the ruins of the German capital took place in the heart of Berlin.
Chapter 9. Panic and Chaos Among the Civilian Population. When the Red Army invaded the suburbs of Berlin and completed the encirclement of the city, the life of the civilian population turned into chaos. For months, the Berliners had been suffering from bombs, hunger, and the fear of the advance of the Soviets, but now the catastrophe had befallen them directly. What had previously been only the distant rumble of the front was now the roar of the tank tracks at the front door, the crash of artillery in the next street, the splintering of the window panes, and the deafening whistling of the shells that struck day and night. The panic spread like wildfire. Everyone knew that there was no escape. The city was surrounded, escape routes to the west were cut off, and anyone who still hoped that the Americans or British would be able to arrive in time had to face the bitter truth. The only army that would enter Berlin was that of the Soviets. This prospect spread sheer fear. The stories about the actions of the Red Army in East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania had spread in countless whispers. Women tied scarves around their heads, smeared dirt on their faces to appear older and more inconspicuous. Mothers hid their daughters in basements or tried to place them with acquaintances. Everyone was looking for a way out, but there was no safe place. The streets of the city were filled with an incessant stream of desperate people. Refugees from the east who had believed they would find shelter in Berlin were now wandering among the rubble. Families who had been driven out of bombed-out houses pushed handcarts with their last belongings. Children clung to their parents' hands while gunshots echoed above them and clouds of smoke drifted through the streets. There was rubble everywhere, the stench of decay and smoke everywhere. The supply finally collapsed. Bakeries had nothing left to sell, butchers were empty, even potato supplies were running out. The last foodstuffs were traded on the black market at astronomical prices. Those who no longer had jewelry, a watch, or a fur coat to exchange had to starve. Many Berliners lived on watery soups made from rutabaga or on what they could find in the rubble. Some went out into parks or on fallow land to collect grass or dandelions. Hunger became an omnipresent companion that weakened people just as much as the fear of the coming battles. In addition, there was the omnipresent violence. The last remnants of order collapsed. Although units of the police, the SS, or the Volkssturm still patrolled the streets, they were mostly only concerned with themselves or looking for deserters. Looting occurred more and more frequently. Desperate people broke into abandoned apartments looking for food, clothing, or fuel. Those who owned something tried to hide it. Those who had nothing left were at the mercy of misery. The propaganda continued to try to persuade people to persevere. Loudspeaker cars drove through the streets and announced that Berlin had been declared a fortress that would never fall into enemy hands. But these words seemed hollow in the face of the reality that everyone could see for themselves. On the street corners lay dead soldiers, run over by tanks or torn to shreds by grenades. In the ruins, people wandered around who had lost everything. The belief in victory had long since disappeared. All that remained was the naked fear of what was to come. Many Berliners sought shelter in basements. The cellar vaults became temporary living spaces, overcrowded with people who stayed there day and night. Candles provided dim light, the air was stuffy, and fear was omnipresent. Children cried, old people moaned, mothers tried to comfort with soft songs, while outside the roar of the artillery never stopped. Sometimes an impact shook the building, dust trickled from the ceilings, and panic broke out.
In these dark rooms, scenes took place that showed the horror of war in all its inhumanity. Birth and death, despair and hopelessness in close proximity to each other. The fear of the Red Army determined people's thinking. Some tried to prepare themselves by pinning notes to their doors. "Only women and children live here," or "No soldiers in the house." Others hid in basements, in churches, or in hospitals, hoping that these places would be spared. But most knew that there would be no safe place when the city was stormed. Many women tried to protect themselves by considering suicide as a last resort. Cyanide capsules were hoarded, ropes were prepared, even pistols, if they were available, were kept at hand. Entire families talked about whether they should choose death together rather than endure the horror of an occupation. This terrible election was an expression of the despair that had settled over Berlin in recent days. The chaos did not stop at the institutions. Hospitals were overcrowded, medicines were scarce, doctors and nurses were overworked. Wounded soldiers lay in the corridors, while outside the war was getting closer and closer. Many wounded knew that they could no longer be evacuated and faced their fate with resignation. At the same time, more and more people were injured. Civilians who had been hit by shells, children with shrapnel wounds, women who had come under fire while trying to fetch water. The mood in the population fluctuated between panic, lethargy, and fanatical blindness. There were still people who believed in Hitler, who wrote slogans of perseverance on the walls or urged young men to join the Volkssturm. But the majority was only driven by the desire to ensure their own survival and that of their family. Moral categories became blurred, survival instinct determined action. With every day that the front line approached, the chaos increased. In some streets, control changed several times a day. When Soviet troops briefly moved in, were pushed back, and returned again. Residents of these neighborhoods lived in constant fear of being caught between the fronts. Bullets whistled through windows, houses burned, people fled in panic from basements, only to seek shelter again in the next street. Berlin had become a city that froze in a state of emergency. No order, no security, no more confidence in the future. The civilian population was faced with the naked fact that the catastrophe was inevitable. Panic spread, chaos determined daily life. Every day brought new destruction, new losses, new horrors. The former cosmopolitan city of Berlin had become an apocalyptic scene in which the last chapters of the Second World War played out with brutal severity.
Chapter 10. The Battles in the North, Oranienburg and Reinickendorf. While the Red Army advanced on Berlin with unstoppable force after its breakthrough over the Seelow Heights, particularly tough fighting developed in the north of the city. Here in the Oranienburg area, and later in the northern districts of Reinickendorf, it became clear how bitterly the Germans tried to delay the advance and how uncompromising the Soviet attackers were. Oranienburg, about 30 kilometers north of Berlin, had a double meaning. On the one hand, it was a strategically important transport hub from which roads and railway lines led directly to the capital. On the other hand, there were armaments installations and military installations in the vicinity that were important for defense. But for many Germans, Oranienburg was also a place of horror. This is where the Sachsenhausen concentration camp was located, whose inmates were driven on death marches in April 1945. When the Red Army reached the city, it came across the last traces of this crime, and the soldiers' anger against the perpetrators erupted with all the greater severity. The defenders of Oranienburg consisted of remnants of Wehrmacht units, Volkssturm, and some SS units. They were greatly outnumbered and outgunned, but the order was clear: no retreat, no surrender. This led to fighting that reduced the city to rubble. Artillery fire turned streets into rubble. Tanks rolled through the narrow streets, and the civilian population desperately sought shelter in basements. Those who had not fled experienced days of horror. In the end, the German defenders had no chance. Oranienburg fell, and with it the northern access to Berlin opened for the Soviet troops. From Oranienburg, the Soviet units advanced further towards Reinickendorf.
The northern districts of Berlin, once suburbs of working-class housing, small factories, and quiet streets, were now transformed into a battlefield. The Germans had erected barricades, blown up bridges, and dug trenches, but the superiority of the Red Army could not be stopped. Entire regiments advanced with tanks and artillery, while German units from all available forces resisted. Reinickendorf was particularly fiercely contested because it offered a direct connection to the city center. From here, Müllerstrasse led towards Wedding and on to the core of the capital. The Soviet commanders knew that they could achieve a decisive breakthrough here and deployed their forces accordingly. For the defenders, every street was a last stop, every cellar an improvised fortress. Young Hitler youth stood on street corners with rocket-propelled grenades, while Volkssturm units fought with outdated rifles. The defenders often lay in basements or attics, from where they fired at Soviet tanks. But the answer was not long in coming. Artillery hit the houses, entire streets collapsed under the shelling. For the civilian population in Reinickendorf, these days were hell. Everyday life consisted of endless waiting in the basement, interrupted by panicked runs through the streets when water had to be fetched or food had to be sought. Many houses were already on fire, smoke filled the streets, and explosions and gunshots constantly echoed through the air. Children screamed, old people collapsed under the weight of fear, and women tried to keep their families together while outside the war was inexorably approaching. The Soviet soldiers who advanced into the neighborhoods acted with a mixture of discipline and unbridled revenge. Some behaved correctly, but many saw every German as an enemy. There was looting, attacks, and acts of violence, which increased the suffering of the civilian population. The Germans who could no longer flee had to endure while their world sank into rubble and ashes. Despite everything, the defenders in Reinickendorf put up stubborn resistance. Streets changed hands several times a day. A house that was still in Soviet hands in the morning could be recaptured by German troops in the evening, only to be attacked again during the night. The fighting was fought from door to door, with hand grenades, submachine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. For the soldiers on both sides, it was a nightmare. Confusing terrain, constant danger, and death around every corner. But the outcome was inevitable. The Red Army had the means to bring in more and more new units, while the Germans collapsed on all fronts. The resistance in Reinickendorf could at most delay the advance, but could not stop it. Step by step, the Soviet troops penetrated further into the northern parts of the city. Tram depots, factories, and railway stations were captured. Bridges over the Hohenzollern Canal were secured. This brought the Red Army closer and closer to the center of Berlin. For Berliners in the north of the city, these days meant the loss of all hope. Many had hoped that the Western Allies might be able to intervene after all, or that a miracle would happen. But the reality was brutal. Tanks with red stars were everywhere. Columns of soldiers were marching everywhere. The fighting moved inexorably closer to Wedding, to the government district, to the heart of the city. The battles in Oranienburg and Reinickendorf were a reflection of the entire battle for Berlin. Desperate resistance on the German side, merciless offensive on the Soviet side. For the people who lived in these districts, it was a time full of fear, hunger, and violence. Berlin was strangled from the north, and the civilian population was caught in the middle of it. Thus, the north of the capital became another scene of destruction. Every street, every square, every house became a battlefield. And while the fighting pushed further south, everyone knew that it was only a matter of time before the heart of the imperial capital would be reached and the last resistance would be broken.
Chapter 11. The Battles in the South, Neukölln and Tempelhof. While the Red Army had already advanced deep into Berlin from the north and east, an equally fierce battle began in the south of the city at the same time. The districts of Neukölln and Tempelhof became the scene of the heaviest battles, in which the brutality of the street battles was shown in all its severity. For the Soviet leadership, the South was of strategic importance. From here, they could threaten the inner-city defense ring as well as capture the airfields, which were vital for the Germans. Neukölln, a densely populated working-class district with narrow streets and large tenements, offered the defenders numerous opportunities to entrench themselves. The German troops knew that every step back would bring them closer to destruction, and so they tried to resist particularly stubbornly in this part of the city. Volkssturm units, Hitler Youth groups, and scattered Wehrmacht soldiers occupied blocks of houses, erected barricades, and laid mines. They were poorly equipped, but they had the advantage of local knowledge and dense development, which made it difficult for the Soviet tanks to advance. When the first Soviet units entered Neukölln, the district turned into an inferno. Tanks rattled through the main streets while infantrymen advanced from house to house. Any resistance was broken with massive violence. Houses from which shots were fired were shot down by artillery. Entire streets were soon in flames. The sweet, acrid smell of smoke, dust, and death hung in the air. And the people who were still holding out in the cellars heard the impacts, the splintering of wood and stone, the bursting of glass. The civilian population in Neukölln experienced days of horror. Many families had been sitting in overcrowded cellars for weeks without sufficient food, with hardly any drinking water, and without hope. Now the fighting penetrated directly into their neighborhoods. Grenades hit houses, cellars collapsed, and people were buried under rubble. Those who had the courage to go outside risked their lives. Bullets whistled through the streets, tanks fired into houses, and dangers lurked everywhere. Many women tried to protect their children with blankets or pillows, as if they could do something against the violence of grenades and gunfire. The defenders fought desperately. Bazookas were fired from windows, Molotov cocktails were thrown from rooftops. Soviet tanks that entered the narrow streets were often suddenly shelled from all sides. But every destroyed tank immediately provoked massive return fire. The Red Army responded with overwhelming force. Houses in which resistance was suspected were shot down with grenades or set on fire. In the end, entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. Meanwhile, another part of the Soviet offensive was concentrated on Tempelhof. The airport there was one of the main targets of the Red Army, because it was one of the last functioning airfields in Berlin and had immense symbolic and strategic importance. Supply flights had been possible via Tempelhof until the very end, and the leadership in Berlin was pinning its hopes on the fact that at least some supply planes or connecting flights with the last Allies could take place. For Stalin, however, it was important to conquer this airfield as quickly as possible in order to cut off any possibility of escape or supply for the German leadership. The battle for Tempelhof became one of the toughest conflicts on the Southern Front. The Germans had heavily fortified the airport, dug trenches, set up anti-aircraft positions, and converted the large halls into fortresses. Volkssturm, Wehrmacht, and SS units defended the area with extreme doggedness. For them, Tempelhof was more than just an airfield. It was one of the last hubs where hope was still alive. The Red Army attacked with massive force. Tanks rolled over the runways, while infantry attacked the halls and buildings. Artillery and Katyusha rocket launchers covered the area with a hail of fire. The German defenders fought back fiercely, shooting at tanks with anti-aircraft guns, using every weapon that was still available. But the resistance was hopeless from the beginning. The Soviet superiority was too great, and the Germans could not expect reinforcements. When the Soviets finally entered the large hangars and administrative buildings, hand-to-hand fighting ensued in a brutal manner that could hardly be surprised. Hand grenades flew through the halls, submachine gun fire echoed from the steel girders, and soldiers fought man-to-man between debris and burning planes. In the end, the defenders were overwhelmed, and the airport fell into Soviet hands. This extinguished one of the last glimmers of hope of the German leadership. With the capture of Tempelhof and the advance in Neukölln, the southern access to the heart of Berlin was open. The Red Army continued to push towards Kreuzberg and Tiergarten, and the ring around the city tightened.
For the civilian population in Neukölln and Tempelhof, this meant days and nights full of horror. Entire streets lay in ruins, cellars were overcrowded, diseases and epidemics threatened, and people lived on the last supplies they had found somewhere. In the midst of this chaos, countless individual tragedies played out. Women became victims of violence, children lost their parents, families were torn apart. Some people sought comfort in churches, others looked for a way to escape, even if there were hardly any ways left. Suicides increased because many saw no other way out. The suffering was boundless, and the hope of salvation faded with each passing day. The fighting in the South once again showed the merciless dynamics of the Battle of Berlin. Every resistance was crushed with brutal force. Every district was conquered step by step. For the defenders, it was a battle without prospects. For the attackers, a battle that they wanted to bring to an end by all means. Neukölln and Tempelhof were exemplary of what was happening throughout the city. A tenacious, desperate resistance that ultimately perished in the rubble. So the fighting in the South ended with a clear result. The Red Army had secured the advance, captured Tempelhof Airport, and cleared the way to the city center. For the civilian population in Neukölln and Tempelhof, this meant the end of all hopes, the end of all illusions. The city was in flames, and doom had become inevitable.
Chapter 12. The Role of the Hitler Youth and the Volkssturm. When the Red Army reached Berlin from all sides in April 1945 and the battle for the city began, the Wehrmacht had hardly any regular forces left to delay the downfall. Most of the frontline formations had been smashed, the armored divisions were only shadows of their former strength, and the Luftwaffe practically no longer existed. In order to be able to fulfill the order of the Führer to defend the capital to the last man, the regime resorted to two desperate formations, the Hitler Youth and the Volkssturm. Both tragically embodied the state of the Third Reich in its last days. The one as youthful victims of fanatical indoctrination, the other as the last reserve of old people, children, and the disabled who were forced into a battle they could never win. The Hitler Youth has been a central part of the system since the early years of the Nazi dictatorship. Millions of children and young people had been captivated by parades, flags, songs, and ideology. During the war, the age groups were increasingly called up at an early age, first for auxiliary services, later for combat missions. In the spring of 1945, many 15- and 16-year-olds were already in uniform, trained on the bazooka, drilled in perseverance slogans. For them, the war was no longer abstract, but part of their everyday lives. But while some still dreamed of the promises of victory, others had long understood that they served as cannon fodder. In Berlin, these young people played a tragic role. They were posted on street corners, equipped with bazookas and carbines, and sent out in small groups to stop Soviet tanks. They often lay in the ruins of houses, lurked at crossroads, or waited in cellars. When a tank passed, they threw themselves out of cover, shot, and hoped to hit the Colossus. Some were successful, many were mowed down immediately. Entire groups of Hitler Youth died within a few minutes, while their commanders had urged them to make sacrifices with fanatical speeches. Contemporary witnesses reported how harrowing it was to see these boys fight. Children with serious faces, helmets that were much too big, weapons that were far too heavy, who carried out orders with childlike seriousness that led them to their deaths. Some were still decorated for bravery in the final days of the battle, but these medals were only sad symbols of a regime that was willing to sacrifice its own youth for a long-lost war. At the same time, the Volkssturm went into action. This troop had been founded in the autumn of 1944, when military defeat was already foreseeable. Every male German between the ages of 16 and 60 who had not already served in the Wehrmacht should come forward. Old men, war invalids, young people, and civilians were dressed in gray uniforms, equipped with armbands and outdated rifles. Many received hardly any training. Some had not held a weapon in their hands since the First World War. Nevertheless, they were sent into battle as the last reserve. In Berlin, the Volkssturm formed the core of inner-city defense. Men who had just worked in factories or offices suddenly found themselves in trenches or on barricades. They carried weapons from old stocks, French-captured weapons, sometimes only hunting rifles. Their task was to block roads, attack tanks with explosive charges, or perform guard duty. Many of them knew that they had little chance. But the pressure was immense. Anyone who refused could be executed as a Wehrkraftsgesetzer. The Gestapo and the SS monitored every step. The image of the last defenders of Berlin was a grotesque reflection of the downfall. Children in uniform, old men with crutches, disabled people with prosthetic arms, all side by side in trenches that were overrun by Soviet tanks within minutes. Some fought with astonishing doggedness, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps out of fear of the consequences of defeat. Others threw away their weapons after a short time, or fled to the cellars to be with their families. For the civilian population, the sight of these improvised troops was deeply disturbing. Parents saw their sons sent to their deaths. Grandfathers had to watch as they themselves still reached for the rifle even though they could hardly walk. Many people realized in those days that the regime was not only militarily finished, but also morally. The willingness to drive children and old people into a hopeless struggle revealed the full cruelty and blindness of the Nazi leadership. However, the Hitler Youth and the Volkssturm were not only victims, they were also deliberately used by the leadership as instruments of propaganda. Goebbels had pictures circulated showing children with bazookas as a symbol of bravery and sacrifice. These images were intended to encourage the population to persevere. In reality, however, they only showed the desperation of a regime that no longer had any real soldiers. These encounters also left their mark within the Red Army. Many soldiers were amazed when they had to fight against children and old men. Some felt pity. Others reacted with even greater severity, seeing in every armed man an enemy who threatened their own lives. The gray areas blurred, and so there were numerous atrocities that particularly affected the weakest defenders. In the last days of the battle, the Hitler Youth and Volkssturm still played a major role in the defense of individual streets. In Neukölln, Reinickendorf, Lichtenberg, and other districts, they were at the forefront. Some groups literally fought to the last man. There are reports that after the battle, Soviet tanks rolled over dozens of corpses of boys who had been sitting in school just a few hours earlier. But all this resistance could not stop the downfall. The Hitler Youth and the Volkssturm were not able to seriously stop the Red Army. They delayed the advance perhaps by hours, in some places by a day. But the fate of Berlin had long since been sealed. In the end, they remained as a symbol of the desperation of a regime that was willing to fight to the last at the expense of those who bore the least responsibility for the war. For the survivors, the memory of this time was a lifelong trauma. Many who stood at the barricades as teenagers at the time did not talk about it until decades later. Some were proud to have done their duty. Others felt shame that they had allowed themselves to be drawn into delusion. But one thing was clear to everyone. They had been used, abused, for a war that had long been lost. Thus, the role of the Hitler Youth and the Volkssturm became one of the darkest chapters of the Battle of Berlin. They showed how deep the regime's desperation was and how brutally it sacrificed even the weakest. In the end, they were not the saviors of the capital, but the last victims of an ideology that left only destruction and death in its wake.
Chapter 13: Daily Hell, Street and Urban Combat. The street and house fighting that raged in Berlin in April 1945 was one of the most brutal and destructive forms of war.
Since the first advances of the Red Army into the outer districts, it had become apparent that the defense of the capital would not be fought in open field battles, but in the narrow streets, between ruins, in cellars and attics. For the soldiers on both sides, this meant an uninterrupted confrontation at the shortest distance, without sparing, without a breather, day and night. For the civilian population that endured in the midst of these battles, it was a permanent hell. The Red Army advanced systematically. Tanks pushed through the main streets, accompanied by infantry who controlled every side street, every front door, every window. As soon as resistance arose, Soviet guns opened fire. Houses from which shots came were unceremoniously razed to the ground. Entire streets burned, while debris blocked the way. Nevertheless, the advance was no walk in the park. The German defense, improvised as it was, used every loophole, every cover to disrupt the superior force. The bazookas, which had been distributed en masse to the Volkssturm and the Hitler Youth, developed into one of the greatest dangers for the Soviet tanks. In the narrow streets of Berlin, the T-34 and IS-2 could hardly maneuver. As soon as they passed a corner, defenders were often already waiting in basements or behind barricades. A well-aimed shot at close range was enough to set a tank on fire. Some Soviet commanders later said that Berlin had devoured more tanks than many a major offensive at the front. But the losses could only delay the advance, not stop it. For the German defenders, this house-to-house fight was a desperate fight for survival. They knew the streets, knew about the best covers, could move around in the widely ramified cellars, which often connected entire streets with each other. Children and young people took over reporting rounds through the cellars. Women carried water or ammunition. Everyone who could still walk was part of this hopeless struggle. But his strength dwindled with every day. Ammunition was scarce, food was almost non-existent, nerves were at an end. The Soviet soldiers fought under conditions that brought them to the border themselves. The house-to-house fighting was no less dangerous for them. A German defender could lurk behind every door. A bazooka could shoot out from behind every window. Grenades exploded in narrow corridors, submachine gun fire echoed through stairwells while ceilings collapsed above them. The advance became a bloody meter-by-meter battle, in which every advance was paid for with high losses. For the civilian population, it was a life in the constant shadow of death. There was a stuffy, oppressive atmosphere in the cellars. Dozens of people sat together in a confined space, heard the crash of the fighting directly above their heads, felt the ground shake when a shell hit. Again and again, houses collapsed, burying entire families. Those who survived crawled through the rubble to seek shelter in the nearest cellar. Life was reduced to trying to experience the next day, to survive the next impact. Water became one of the biggest problems. Pipes were destroyed, pumps no longer worked. Women and children crept through the streets with buckets, often risking their lives, to get to public fountains or rivers. Many were hit by bullets or wounded by shrapnel. There was hardly any food left. Those who had something shared it provisionally. Some cooked soup from grass or leaves to keep their children alive. The street fighting also demanded a psychological dimension that was almost unbearable. The constant noise, the feeling of not being safe anywhere, the knowledge that every second could be the last moment, ate into people's souls. Some broke because of it, others hardened. Many soldiers and civilians lost all inhibition during these days. Looting, violence, and acts of revenge were part of everyday life. The moral boundaries became blurred. Bare survival was the only criterion. A particularly brutal aspect of urban combat was the use of flamethrowers. The Red Army used them to drive defenders out of cellars and bunkers. A short burst of fire was enough to set fire to entire rooms in which people had barricaded themselves. For the victims, this was an agonizing death. For the survivors, a trauma that burned itself deeply. Hand grenades were also used en masse. Often the soldiers blindly threw them into rooms before entering. In the cramped conditions, they caused devastating damage. Street fighting in Berlin also meant that neighborhoods were wiped out in hours. Streets where people lived a few days ago were now smoking piles of rubble. Schools, churches, hospitals, nothing was spared. Even the large buildings in the center, such as the Reichstag building, the Ministry of Finance, or the universities, soon became part of these apocalyptic battles. Every wall that was still standing became a cover, every window a field of fire. Despite all the harshness, the Red Army continued to advance steadily. Their losses were high, but their mass was overwhelming. More and more units poured in, more and more tanks rolled into the city. The Germans could only delay. All resistance ended in destruction. Entire battalions of the Volkssturm disbanded within hours because they could not withstand the violence of the attacks. Even experienced frontline soldiers had to realize that they could only buy time in the ruins of the capital. There was no choice. Many were drawn into the midst of the fighting. Women dragged the wounded, children served as messengers, old men stood guard with rifles that barely worked. The line between fighters and civilians became blurred. This made the fighting even more cruel because the Soviet soldiers often could not distinguish who was the enemy and who was just trying to survive. At the end of those days, Berlin was a city of smoke and rubble. The house-to-house fighting had turned the once proud streets into burial grounds. Every advance of the Red Army left a trail of devastation in its wake. For the defenders, it meant certain death or imprisonment. For the civilians, a continuous torture that could hardly be put into words. The street and house fighting in Berlin in 1945 is synonymous with the end of the Second World War in Europe. It was not only a military struggle, but a human catastrophe. The daily fighting, the constant crashing and dying, the life in the basement, and the constant fear, all this made the capital of the Third Reich an inferno that was unparalleled in the last days of April.
Chapter 14. The Fall of Tempelhof Airport. In the last days of the war, Tempelhof Airport was more than just an airfield in Berlin. He was a symbol, a beacon of hope, and a key strategic point at the same time. In the eyes of the German leadership, it stood for a final connection to the outside world, perhaps for escape opportunities, for supplies, or at least for the appearance that the capital was not yet completely cut off. For the Red Army, on the other hand, Tempelhof was a coveted target, because its capture would not only bring down an important base, but also shatter a piece of German hope. The airport, built in the 1930s and developed into one of the most modern in Europe, was an important part of the military infrastructure of the Reich during the war years. Now, in April 1945, it was one of the last functioning airfields in the capital. Occasionally, planes still landed and took off. Courier planes, transport planes, sometimes even small evacuation flights for high-ranking party officials. But the Soviet grip on Berlin made such undertakings increasingly dangerous. Any plane that took off risked being shot down immediately by Soviet fighters. Nevertheless, the population as well as some functionaries believed that there could still be a connection to the outside world via Tempelhof. The defense of the airport was correspondingly stubbornly organized. Wehrmacht units, anti-aircraft soldiers, SS and Volkssturm units had taken up positions around the extensive grounds. The gigantic hangars and administrative buildings were converted into fortresses. Loopholes were cut into walls. Machine guns were posted on the roofs. Anti-aircraft guns, which were once intended to fend off enemy bombers, were now directed against the approaching Soviet tanks. For the defenders, Tempelhof was not only a military target, but also a symbol of perseverance in a city that had long since sunk into chaos. The Red Army prepared with all determination for the capture of the airport. Fierce fighting was already raging in Neukölln, in which Soviet troops worked their way forward street by street. From there, it was only a short way to the airport grounds. The Soviet leadership knew that a quick capture of Tempelhof would severely weaken the German resistance. In addition, the airport also had a symbolic meaning for Stalin and his generals. It was one of the last visible proofs that Berlin was still an open city. When the Soviet tank columns finally reached the suburbs of Tempelhof, the area turned into an inferno. Artillery fire struck the runways, rocket launchers reduced the runways to rubble, and Soviet infantry pushed on the outer defensive positions. The Germans defended themselves doggedly.
Bazookas fired from basement windows and barricades, anti-aircraft guns thundered against the approaching tanks, and fierce firefights broke out from the hangars. For the defenders, it was a desperate struggle, because they knew that Tempelhof was more than just an airfield. It was one of the last places where the illusion of defense clung to it. However, the Soviet superiority could not be stopped. Tanks rolled across the runway. Soviet troops entered the halls. What followed were hand-to-hand combat of a hardness that was hardly imaginable in open battles. Submachine gun fire echoed through the gigantic halls. Grenades exploded between plane wrecks, and flamethrowers set entire parts of buildings on fire. German defenders entrenched themselves behind concrete pillars and steel girders, while Soviet soldiers cleaned room by room. The airport, once a symbol of modern technology and mobility, was transformed into a battlefield full of smoke, blood, and debris. Civilians who had hidden on the airport grounds also got caught in the maelstrom. Some families had hoped to find shelter from the fighting in the surrounding neighborhoods in the large buildings. But now they were in the middle of the front. Many fled to the cellars and underground facilities, where they held out among the wounded and soldiers. Fear was omnipresent. Grenades shook the walls. Fire spread to the halls. Screams echoed through the corridors. There was no escape for the civilians. The defenders held out for hours and days, but the situation was hopeless. Every destroyed tank, every repulsed attack was immediately answered by new Soviet waves. The Red Army had the means to continue the fight inexorably, while the Germans were bleeding to death in ammunition and forces. Soon, the last anti-aircraft positions were eliminated, and the hangars were taken one after the other. With the final capture of the airport, another piece of German defense collapsed. Tempelhof had fallen, and with it, the last major airfield in Berlin was lost. For Hitler and his followers in the bunker, this meant the loss of any theoretical possibility of leaving the city. Evacuation plans, secret flights, the hope of final connections, all that was now history. The city was finally cut off from the outside world, enclosed in an iron ring of Soviet troops. For the Red Army, the victory at Tempelhof was a milestone. With it, the way to the center of Berlin was open. Kreuzberg, Tiergarten, the government district, all that was now within reach. For the soldiers, the victory over Tempelhof was not only a military success, but also a symbolic signal. The capital of the Third Reich was finally at its end. But the price was high. On both the Soviet and German sides, the fighting had claimed enormous losses. The airport, once a place of technology and progress, was now a smoking field of rubble, littered with corpses, destroyed tanks, and plane wrecks. The halls were burned out, the runways were crisscrossed by bomb craters. Tempelhof was no longer the proud airport of the pre-war period, but a monument to destruction. For the people of Berlin, the fall of the airport was a shock. Many had hoped that another miracle could happen from here, that the Führer would be flown out, that supplies could arrive, or that the city would at least retain a sign of hope. With the loss of Tempelhof, this illusion finally collapsed. People now knew there was no way out. Doom was inevitable. The capture of Tempelhof Airport marked a decisive moment in the Battle of Berlin. It showed the complete hopelessness of the defense and the final loss of any connection to the outside world. For the Red Army, it was a triumph. For the defenders, a disaster. For the civil population, a further step towards the abyss. Berlin was now completely thrown back on itself, and the final was inevitably approaching.
Chapter 15. The Battle for the Government Quarter. In the last days of April 1945, the government district in the heart of Berlin became the scene of perhaps the most symbolic battles of the entire battle. Here, where the Reich's Chancellery, the Propaganda Ministry, the Ministry of Finance, and numerous other government buildings were located, the defense was concentrated in a desperate attempt to hold the center of power to the end. For the Red Army, this district was the real destination, the place where Hitler and his closest confidants stayed, and where the war in the heart of Europe was to be finally decided.
The approach of the Soviet troops to the government district was accompanied by continuous artillery fire. Day and night, shells hit the streets. Entire buildings collapsed. Clouds of smoke hung over the city, and the sun was barely visible. For the civilian population who held out in basements, it was an inferno that seemed to have no end. But despite the oppressive situation, the German defenders had developed the area around the Reichschancellery into a fortress. Barricades, machine gun nests, and anti-tank barriers were erected. Cellar vaults were converted into bunkers. Every street, every square should be fought over. Particularly fierce were the battles for the area around the Reichstag, the symbolic parliament building, which had long since ceased to serve as the seat of democracy, but was invaluable to the Soviet leadership. Stalin had made it clear to his generals that the capture of the Reichstag had top priority. He wanted the image of the red flag on the roof of the Reichstag as a sign of the final victory over Nazi Germany. This symbolism gave the battles for the government quarter an additional brutality, as the Soviet troops threw themselves into battle with undiminished ferocity, while the Germans tried desperately to hold the buildings. The defenders consisted of SS units, remnants of the Wehrmacht, Volkssturm, and Hitler Youth. The SS in particular fought fanatically. For them, surrender was not an option, and many of their fighters vowed to fight until their last breath. They entrenched themselves in the massive administrative buildings, which were ideally suited for defense due to their construction. Thick walls provided protection from artillery, and the numerous corridors and rooms made the advance of Soviet troops extremely difficult. The battles turned into a bloody struggle from room to room, from floor to floor. The Red Army did everything it could to break the resistance. Tanks rolled up to the government buildings, shooting directly into the facades, while infantry entered the ruins. Flamethrowers drove the defenders out of cellars and corridors. Hand grenades exploded in corridors, and machine guns hammered incessantly. The noise was deafening. The stench of smoke, dust, and blood filled the air. Every progress was bought with high losses. For the civilians who still lived in the government district or had sought refuge in the cellars of the large buildings, it was hell on earth. Many families had hoped to find shelter in the massive buildings, but now they have become death traps. Cellars collapsed, fire spread to rooms, and people were trapped between the fronts. Some were driven out by soldiers, others remained buried with no prospect of rescue. A particularly bitter focal point was the Reichstag itself, under which the Führerbunker was located. This is where Hitler held his last meetings, where he wrote his political testament, and where he decided to end his life. While the city lay in ruins above him and the fighting raged, he lived in a ghostly world of concrete rooms in which hope and reality had long since lost their connection. For the defenders, the Chancellery was a symbol that had to be held at all costs, even though they knew that it was only a matter of time before the Soviet troops reached the site. The battle for the government district reached its climate at the end of April. Soviet artillery concentrated its fire on the area, while infantry and tanks advanced meter by meter. The Reichstag was surrounded on all sides and finally stormed. Soviet soldiers hoisted the red flag on the roof several times, but it was shot down again. It was not until 2 May, after days of uninterrupted fighting, that the flag was finally placed on the Reichstag. This image went around the world and became a symbol of victory over Nazi Germany. But while the world celebrated the symbolic capture of the Reichstag, an unabated massacre took place in the streets around it. The German defenders continued to fight, although the situation was hopeless. The SS were still shooting from ruins, Volkssturm units were desperately throwing themselves at tanks, and Hitler Youth were dying with bazookas in their hands. For many of them, it was not a heroic sacrifice, but the result of a fanatical indoctrination that had driven them to their deaths. The Red Army finally took the government quarter with unimaginable losses. Hundreds, even thousands of soldiers fell in the few streets around the Reichschancellery and the Reichstag. But the victory was complete. With the capture of the district, the heart of the capital fell, and the end of the war in Europe was sealed. For the people of Berlin who witnessed this, it was an indelible trauma. They had seen their city go up in flames, how children and the elderly were sacrificed, how every remnant of normality disappeared.
The fighting in the government quarter was the latest proof that the regime had not only failed, but had been prepared to hold out until complete destruction. So the battle for the government quarter ended as one of the bloodiest chapters of the Battle of Berlin. It was a victory for the Red Army, a downfall for the defenders, and a nightmare for the civilian population that surpassed anything that had come before. With the ruins of the Reichstag, the ruins of the Chancellery, and the countless dead on the streets, it became clear that the Third Reich had ceased to exist.
Chapter 16. In the shadow of the Führerbunker. While house-to-house fighting raged outside in the streets of Berlin, artillery and tanks reduced the city to rubble and ashes, and the Red Army moved meter by meter closer to the heart of the capital. A completely different drama played out underground. In the Führerbunker, a widely ramified bunker complex under the Reichschancellery, Adolf Hitler, his closest followers, and a small circle of helpers had entrenched themselves. Here, in the stuffy semi-darkness, where the hum of the fans broke the silence and the roar of the impacts could only be heard muffled, there was an atmosphere that fluctuated between fanatical perseverance, resignation, and paralyzing hopelessness. Hitler himself was only a shadow of his former figure. Marked by illness, insomnia, and the endless defeats of the last few months, he seemed frail, trembling, old. His hands trembled, his posture was bent, his gaze dull. And yet he was still convinced that as a leader he had to hold out until his last breath. He did not want to acknowledge the reality in front of the gates of the bunker. He was still drafting orders to set in motion divisions that had long since ceased to exist. He was still talking about counteroffensives, about armies that would liberate Berlin at the last moment. His generals, who had to take these orders, hardly dared to tell him the truth. In the stuffy rooms of the bunker, there was an oppressive mixture of routine and madness. Adjutants, reporters, and officers ran back and forth in the corridors. Situation maps were studied in small rooms, while outside, reality had long since destroyed any meaning of these maps. Martin Bormann, Hitler's loyal secretary, held the strings of the administration in his hands and tried to control every piece of information. Joseph Goebbels, who had moved into the bunker with his family, still invoked the final victory and convinced himself that a heroic downfall must be the fate of the Germans. In addition to the military elite, a number of civilians had also gathered in the bunker. Secretaries, including Traudl Junge, typed Hitler's orders and finally his political testament until the end. They experienced the bizarre disconnect between the normality of everyday life, meals, conversations, paperwork, and the apocalypse outside. For them, life in the bunker was a mixture of duty, paralyzing fear, and the constant question of whether it would not be better to flee after all. The events in the Führerbunker also had something spooky. While people fought for their lives outside, life down here was characterized by a bizarre everyday life. Meals were served, small conferences were held, even birthday parties took place. On April 20, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, the last loyalists had gathered in the bunker to congratulate him. Outside, the battle was raging, the artillery roared, but down here they toasted with champagne while Hitler bowed his head in silence and bitterness. For many, it was the moment when they finally understood that this man no longer lived in reality. With each passing day, the situation became more hopeless. The front was getting closer, the government district was being fought over, and the bunker was increasingly becoming a prison. Although it was protected against bombing, the impacts caused the walls to shake and the supply situation became catastrophic. Water pipes failed, food became scarce, the air was filled with cigarette smoke and stale moisture. Illnesses spread, insomnia and nervous crises spread. Nevertheless, many in the bunker held on to Hitler until the end. Goebbels swore not to flee, but to die with his family in Berlin. Bormann urged orders to hold out and checked who had access to the Führer. Eva Braun, Hitler's lover, had also gone to the bunker. She lived in the conviction that she would be by his side until the end, and showed an almost ghostly calm in the face of doom. For her, it was a mixture of love, loyalty, and delusion that made her stay. In the last days before Hitler's death, the atmosphere in the Führerbunker condensed into a mixture of apocalyptic mood and macabre everyday life. While Soviet troops fought for the Reichstag outside, Hitler dictated his political testament. He spoke of traitors in his own ranks, of the guilt of the generals, of the future of National Socialism, which supposedly had to survive beyond his death. For those who listened to him, it was a document full of delusion and loss of reality. At the same time, rumors and reports about the advance of the Red Army intensified. With every day, the impacts came closer. With every day, new streets fell in the government district. The bunker was cut off more and more from the outside world. Only a few messengers dared to go out to obtain information or deliver orders. Many did not return. The circle around Hitler became narrower, not only spatially, but also psychologically. It was a small world full of mistrust, fear, and unspoken questions. How would this end? On April 29th and 30, the situation finally came to a head. Hitler married Eva Braun in a short, almost surreal ceremony in the bunker. While the shells were hitting outside and the city was in flames, the two said, "I do," in a simple celebration. Hitler then committed suicide, as he had announced. He ended his life with one shot, while Eva Braun took poison. The bodies were burned in the garden of the Reichschancellery in the midst of the chaos of the last fighting. After Hitler's death, chaotic chaos broke out in the bunker. Some of his followers tried to flee, others gave in to their despair. Goebbels, who still clung to his loyalty to the Führer, poisoned his children and committed suicide together with his wife. Bormann tried to escape in the last hours. His fate remained unclear for a long time. The secretaries and helpers who had survived later reported a mood of panic, resignation, and paralyzing unreality. The Führerbunker thus became a symbol of doom. While outside in the streets of Berlin, the war reached its last, cruelest climax, here the life of the man who had unleashed it ended. For posterity, the bunker remained a place of horror and absurdity, a symbol of the megalomania and delusion that had led to its downfall. In the shadow of the Führerbunker, it became clear that the Battle of Berlin was not only a military struggle, but also a psychological drama. Down here lived people who still believed in ideals that had long since been destroyed, and others who were desperately trying to survive near power. It was a world between megalomania and catastrophe, between loyalty and betrayal, between everyday life and apocalypse. Thus, the bunker stood not only for the physical withdrawal of the leadership, but also for the mental isolation from reality. While an entire city was burning outside, here people clung to illusions, to orders, to a power that had long since disappeared. In the shadow of the Führerbunker, the last act of a dictatorship was revealed, which was ready to tear everything into the abyss, and which nevertheless came to an end in an underground dungeon.
Chapter 17: Suicides, Last Orders, and the Fall of Hitler. The last days of April 1945 were marked by a mixture of inexorable military collapse and a series of suicides that accompanied the end of the Third Reich like a macabre chain. While the Red Army was inexorably advancing into the center of Berlin and the battle for the government district was raging, the leadership of the Reich retreated underground and made its final decisions there. Hitler's downfall and the deaths of many of his followers became a symbol of a rule that remained trapped in delusion and despair until the end. Adolf Hitler had long since decided not to fall into the hands of his enemies. For weeks, he had been talking about preferring death to life in captivity. It was clear to him that he did not want to end up like Mussolini, who had been captured, shot, and put on display by partisans a few days earlier. In his fanatical worldview, Hitler had linked the downfall to a heroic sacrifice. The thought that he could become a martyr figure even in death accompanied him until his last hours. On April 29, 1945, he married Eva Braun in the bunker. It was a bizarre scene that stood in stark contrast to the reality above Earth.
While artillery and machine guns roared outside, the city was in flames and the Red Army was getting closer and closer. A simple wedding ceremony took place in the narrow space of the bunker. Shortly thereafter, Hitler dictated his political and personal will. In it, he appointed new successors, spoke about traitors who had allegedly abandoned him, and once again invoked the continued existence of National Socialism. But in reality, it was the document of a man who had long been living in the abyss. On April 30th, around noon, Hitler withdrew with Eva Braun to his study in the bunker. Witnesses later reported that he said goodbye to his closest associates with a firm but at the same time broken look. A little later, a shot was heard. When the chamber was opened, Hitler was lying dead on the sofa, Eva Braun next to him, dead of poison. His body was doused with gasoline, as he had ordered, and burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. This was the end of the life of the man who had plunged Europe into an unprecedented war, not in open combat, but in a dark cellar marked by delusion and doom. But Hitler was not the only one who sought death in those days. Even before that, many high-ranking National Socialists had chosen suicide, unable to bear defeat or fear the revenge of the victors. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, Hitler's military advisors, planned to escape, but many others gave up. Joseph Goebbels, the Führer's most fanatical confidant, stayed in the bunker with his family. It was clear to him that he would only die with Hitler. On May 1, 1945, he had his 6 children killed with poison, together with his wife Magda. Both then committed suicide. The killing of the children, who had still happily played in the bunker rooms, became one of the cruelest symbols of the fanatical will to perish. Heinrich Himmler, once one of the most powerful men in the empire, also tried to escape fate. While Hitler died in Berlin, Himmler secretly sought contact with the Western Allies in the hope of a separate peace. But his attempts were rejected. When he was later taken prisoner by the Allies, he took poison and thus evaded responsibility for his crimes. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's deputy, had already defected earlier. His attempts to succeed him ended in his arrest. In Berlin itself, meanwhile, a wave of suicides took place that affected the entire population. Many families decided not to end up in the hands of the Red Army. Rumors of massacres, rapes, and looting had fueled fear and panic. Numerous people took poison, cut their wrists, or hanged themselves. Entire families chose death to escape the supposed horror. Lakes and rivers in and around Berlin filled with corpses because many were desperate to commit suicide in the water. The last orders issued from the bunker seemed like a grotesque spectacle. Hitler had appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor in his will, but he was far away in the north, in Flensburg. The reality in Berlin had long been separated from this political game. The commanders on the ground received contradictory instructions: fight to the last man or start negotiations. Many generals who still had command eventually decided to prepare for surrender to prevent further bloodshed. After Hitler's death, an atmosphere of chaos and resignation broke out in the bunker. Some of his loyalists were still trying to maintain a semblance of order. Others were planning their escape. Martin Bormann tried to break out with a group. His fate remained unclear for a long time, until his remains were found decades later. The secretaries and adjutants awaited their fate. Many surrendered to the Soviets, others were captured. Everyone knew that the end had come. Hitler's last orders, which were dictated in the days before his death, had little practical significance. Orders to non-existent armies, instructions for counteroffensives that would never take place, demands for loyalty and perseverance. They were words into the void, a language without reality. For the generals and officers who listened to them, they were the last echo of a regime that had long since lost touch with reality. On the suicides that shaped events in those days were an expression of a worldview that could not accept defeat. Instead of taking responsibility or looking for a way to rescue, many of those responsible decided to die.
They took their knowledge with them to the grave. Their guilt remained unatoned for. This was a bitter spectacle for the population. While millions had died and continued to die in the war, the leaders evaded their responsibility by judging themselves. Thus, the downfall of Hitler and his closest followers became the final act of the Third Reich. It was not a heroic finale, but a picture of despair, delusion, and moral bankruptcy. In the shadow of the bunker, the men and women who had led Germany to catastrophe died, not upright on the battlefield, but poisoned, shot, in basements far removed from the reality they themselves had created. With these suicides and the last orders, the political and military leadership of the Third Reich had become practically unable to act. What remained were soldiers, civilians, and a destroyed country that could no longer escape capitulation. Hitler's downfall marked the end of an era that had been marked by violence, lies, and megalomania.
Chapter 18. The Capitulation in Berlin. On May 1, 1945, the situation in Berlin was finally hopeless. Hitler was dead, the Reich's chancellery lay in ruins, and the government quarter was almost completely conquered by the Red Army. Fighting was still raging in the streets of the city, but everyone knew that it was only a matter of hours before the last resistance collapsed. For the soldiers who were still fighting, the question was no longer whether, but only when they would lay down their arms. For the civilian population, the capitulation was both an end to the horror and the beginning of an uncertain future. After Hitler took his own life, General Helmuth Weidling took over the supreme command of the defense of Berlin. He was an experienced officer who had tried several times in the last few days to make clear the futility of further resistance. Now he saw it as his duty to stop the bloodshed. In consultation with the remaining commanders and representatives of the Soviet leadership, he prepared the surrender of the city. On the afternoon of May 1st, a delegation of German officers under a white flag went to the Red Army lines. They brought the news of Hitler's death and the willingness to hand over the city. For the Soviet side, this was the decisive moment. For weeks, they had been working towards the day when the German capital would officially fall into their hands. But despite the clear victory, they wanted to see the capitulation formally settled. Weidling negotiated with the Soviet commanders about the conditions. Stalin had unequivocally ordered that no partial negotiation should be accepted. Only a complete and unconditional surrender. The Germans had no choice. They had to accept that all troops in Berlin would lay down their arms. On the evening of May 1st, the capitulation was finally signed. It came into force the next morning. The night of May 1 to 2 was nevertheless marked by chaos. Many German soldiers did not want to surrender to the Soviets. They feared the revenge of the Red Army, captivity, and the hard lot that awaited them. Some tried to break out in small groups and make their way west, hoping to be taken prisoner by the Americans or British. Whole columns of soldiers moved in the darkness through the ruins, past burning houses and over mountains of corpses. But most of these attempts ended in fiasco. Soviet troops had hermetically sealed off the city, and anyone who tried to break through the lines was apprehended or shot. On the morning of May 2, 1945, the guns finally fell silent in Berlin. General Weidling gave the official order to surrender and called on all units still fighting to lay down their arms. White flags appeared in the streets, soldiers threw away rifles, tank crews climbed out of their vehicles. For many, it was a moment of relief, even if it was accompanied by shame and fear. The war that had determined their lives for years was now over in Berlin. The Soviet soldiers who marched through the streets experienced a moment of triumph. For them, this was the victory they had been waiting for so long. They had conquered the enemy's capital, decided the war in Europe. The red flag flew over the Reichstag, and the pictures of it went around the world. Stalin had achieved his goal. The Soviet Union had struck the decisive blow, and Moscow was able to present itself as the main victor over Nazi Germany. But for the civilian population, the capitulation was a moment full of ambivalence.
On the one hand, it meant the end to the incessant terror of the battle. No more artillery fire, no more bombings, no more constant fighting in the streets. On the other hand, it was the beginning of a new phase full of fear and uncertainty. The Red Army had a reputation for brutal treatment of the vanquished, and in the early days, many of these fears were confirmed. Looting, violence, and abuse were part of everyday life. Women hid in basements, children wandered frightened through the rubble, old people collapsed under the burden. The city itself was hardly recognizable. Large parts of Berlin lay in ruins. Entire streets were destroyed, bridges blown up, train stations ruins. Electricity and water supplies had collapsed, and there was hardly any food. There was debris everywhere, and the stench of decay filled the air. Berlin had become a ghost town, where the few survivors wandered among ruins in search of food, water, or a safe place. The capitulation also brought a harsh reality for the German soldiers. Tens of thousands were taken prisoner by the Soviets. For many, this marked the beginning of a path of suffering that would last for years. Transports to prison camps in the East, hunger, forced labor, the fate of many prisoners was as uncertain as it was cruel. Some never returned. For the Soviet commanders, this was not only martial law, but also retaliation for the horrors that the Wehrmacht had caused in the Soviet Union. At the same time, the capitulation in Berlin had enormous symbolic significance for the world. It was the visible proof that the Third Reich had ended. Although fighting would rage for a few more days in other parts of Germany, the war in Europe was practically decided with the fall of the capital. Only a few days later, on May 8, 1945, the general surrender of all German forces followed. For Berliners, May 2nd was a day they should never forget. Many felt relief because the killing stopped. Others felt only emptiness because everything they had believed in was in ruins. Still others were confronted with a struggle for survival that was no less hard than the battle itself. For peace did not bring immediate security, but a period of hunger, deprivation, and oppression that lasted for years. The capitulation in Berlin was the culmination of one of the most devastating battles of the Second World War. It stood for the final downfall of a regime that had sent millions to their deaths, and for the beginning of a new order that was to shape Europe for decades. But for the people who experienced it, it was one thing above all: the end of a hell, which was also the beginning of a new, uncertain world.
Chapter 19. The Suffering After the Battle, Plunder, Revenge, and Hunger. When the guns fell silent on May 2, 1945, and Berlin officially capitulated, the immediate horror of the fighting ended for the population, but a new phase of suffering began, which in many respects was hardly less difficult to bear. The city was in ruins. Hundreds of thousands were dead. The infrastructure had collapsed, and people were faced with the bitter question of how to survive in the ruins. The days after the battle were marked by chaos, violence, hunger, and a deep insecurity that cast a shadow over the survivors. The first reality that many Berliners experienced was the behavior of the Soviet soldiers. For the Red Army, the entry into Berlin was a triumph over the enemy, who had covered their own country with unimaginable brutality for 4 years. Millions of Soviet civilians had been killed, expelled, or deported to camps by the Wehrmacht. Entire villages had been burned down, cities wiped out, families destroyed. The Red Army carried this memory with it, and many soldiers did not see the Germans as innocent people, but as the enemy par excellence who was responsible for all this. In the first days after the capitulation, there were massive attacks. Looting was the order of the day. Shops, apartments, cellars were broken into. Everything that was still usable was taken away. The wave of rapes that countless women experienced in Berlin was particularly bad. Contemporary witnesses report violence on a scale that is hardly imaginable. Women of all ages, from young girls to old women, have been victims of sexual assault. Many of them suffered lifelong physical and mental scars. Some took their own lives, unable to live on with what they had experienced. Men were not spared either. Looting, arbitrary shootings, and acts of violence made life unsafe. Anyone suspected of having been a soldier or SS man risked immediate shooting. Civilians who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time could also become victims of the acts of revenge. The hatred of the victors was mixed with the indiscipline of many soldiers, who took every freedom after years of war in enemy territory. Although Soviet officers increasingly tried to contain the violence, it took weeks to establish a halfway orderly administration. At the same time, hunger was one of the greatest threats. The supply of Berlin had already collapsed during the fighting. After the capitulation, there were hardly any functioning shops left, the people's supplies were used up, and the infrastructure was in ruins. Water was only available at a few pumps, electricity had failed, gas pipes were destroyed. People roamed the ruins in search of something to eat. Nettles, turnips, horse meat from fallen animals, everything that could be used in any way was collected and cooked. The Soviet administration soon began to issue ration cards, but the rations were minimal and barely enough to survive. Many people became emaciated. Diseases such as dysentery and typhoid fever spread. Children suffered particularly badly. Their weak bodies could hardly bear the deficiency. Entire streets of orphans became visible. Children who had lost their parents in the fighting and were now wandering around in the rubble, begging or looking for leftover food. The mental distress was also hard to describe. The war had broken the people, and what happened after the battle did the rest. Women who had been raped had to bear their fate in a society that often showed no understanding. Many tried to suppress what they had experienced, remained silent for decades, or took their secret with them to the grave. Men who could not protect their families suffered from shame and feelings of guilt. The destroyed city reflected the interior of its inhabitants. Everything lay in ruins, and a new beginning seemed unimaginable. In this chaotic time, strategies of survival developed at the same time. Some Berliners sought protection from individual Soviet officers who were trying to restore order and rein in their subordinates. Others tried to get food through barter. Valuables, jewelry, watches, and clothing were exchanged for bread or potatoes. Anyone who still had something of value could survive with it. Those who had nothing were at the mercy of hunger. Slowly, a kind of improvised administration began to function again. The Soviet occupiers placed German anti-fascists in local administrative offices to sort out the chaos. Schools, hospitals, and transport facilities were provisionally put back into operation. But it took months for a certain stability to return. In the first few weeks, arbitrariness and violence prevailed, and for the people, every day was a struggle for survival. The suffering after the battle was also marked by a new social reality. Many women began relationships with Soviet soldiers, partly voluntarily, partly out of coercion, or in the hope of obtaining protection and food. These relationships were often characterized by an unspoken pragmatism. Survival was above all. For many, it meant a break with previous norms. For others, it was simply the only way to get children and families through. The memory of this time remained a taboo subject in Berlin for a long time. The violence, the rapes, the hunger, all of this was suppressed by many or only told behind closed doors. It was not until decades later that contemporary witnesses began to openly talk about it. But the collective memory of the city bore these wounds. The end of the war was not a sudden beginning of peace, but a time of transition marked by pain, deprivation, and humiliation. Thus, May 1945 became not only the month of liberation for Berliners, but also a month of despair. The surrender had ended the battle, but it had created a new reality in which violence, hunger, and grief ruled life. Berlin was a city that was on the ground, a city full of scars, in which people had to learn to live again only slowly. The days and weeks after the battle were therefore a second inferno, less loud, less visible perhaps, but just as destructive. The suffering after the battle was an echo of the war that reverberated for a long time and shaped entire generations.
Chapter 20. Resonance: Berlin as a symbol of doom. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, Berlin was not only the defeated capital of the Third Reich, but a symbol of the downfall of an entire system. No other city reflected the collapse of National Socialist rule as clearly as this metropolis, which Hitler had once intended to expand into the world capital Germania and now lay in the hands of the victors as a desert of rubble. Berlin had been the center of the war, the starting point of the decisions that had cost millions of lives, and it now became a monument of destruction in its own right. The city was hardly recognizable. Entire streets lay in ruins. The striking buildings of the center of power had become ruins. The Reichstag, symbol of the democracy of the Weimar era and now a symbol of the victory of the Red Army, towered into the sky with bombed walls while the red flag flew on its roof. The Reichschancellery was a pile of rubble, the squares around the Brandenburg Gate crisscrossed by shell craters. For Berliners, every glance was a reminder that their city had been the focus of the last desperate battles. But Berlin was not only physically destroyed, it was also morally and spiritually broken. The population, which had followed the promises of Nazi propaganda for years, now found itself in a reality that destroyed all illusions. The promises of victory, greatness, and world domination had gone up in flames, leaving hunger, shame, and the naked necessity of survival. For many people, the experience of collapse was a radical turning point. The structures they had believed in no longer existed, and the question of guilt and responsibility began to burn itself into people's minds, even if it was not immediately opened. For the victors, Berlin was more than a defeated city. For the Soviet Union, the capture of Berlin was the culmination of a gigantic sacrifice. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians had died in this war, and now the Red Army had conquered the heart of the enemy. Berlin was the reward for immeasurable suffering, and the red flags on the Reichstag were the visible confirmation that the Soviet Union had not only survived, but triumphed. For Stalin, Berlin was the stage on which he could stage his claim as a victor and great power leader. Berlin was also a symbol for the Western Allies, albeit with a different meaning. The images of the destroyed city, the reports of Hitler's downfall, the scenes from the ruins, all this went around the world and showed that the war in Europe was really over. Berlin became the benchmark for what National Socialism had done and the starting point for the new order that was now to emerge. In the years to come, the city was also to become the focal point of the Cold War. But by 1945, it was already clear that Berlin was not just a city, but a symbol of power, defeat, and a new beginning at the same time. For the Berliners themselves, the aftermath of the battle was marked by an oppressive ambivalence. On the one hand, many people felt relief that the fighting was finally over. The nights without artillery, the silence of the bombs, the prospect of no longer fearing for their bare lives every day were a liberation for many. On the other hand, the price of this liberation was immeasurably high. They had lost their homes, their relatives, their dignity. They stood in a destroyed city where every stone bore a reminder of death and suffering. The hunger, looting, and violence of the occupation intensified the feeling that the war was over, but peace was still far away. Berlin was a place of gray zone, between liberation and occupation, between guilt and victimhood, between decline and new beginnings. This ambivalence was to shape the memory of 1945 in Berlin for decades. Over time, the city began to reorganize itself. The first structures grew out of the rubble. Women, the so-called rubble women, began to clear the ruins by hand. With their bare hands and simple tools, they hauled stones, cleaned bricks, and stacked rubble. This image later became a myth, but it had a real core. Without these efforts, the city would hardly have been able to make a new start. In the years that followed, Berlin became a symbol of a divided Germany. Soon after the end of the war, the victorious powers divided the city into sectors, and the former allies became opponents in the beginning of the Cold War. The city, which had just been the symbol of the National Socialist downfall, was transformed into a symbol of the global conflict between East and West. But in 1945, immediately after the battle, there was still little sign of this. First of all, it was about survival, cleaning up, about the question of how to build a life in this landscape of ruins. In the aftermath of the battle, Berlin also became a memorial to the horrors of war as a whole. Visitors from all over the world saw in the ruins the consequences of an ideology that had plunged Europe into ruin. For historians and politicians alike, Berlin became a place of reflection. It showed where megalomania, racism, and warmongering could lead. For many Berliners, however, this symbolism was secondary. They did not live in grand interpretations, but in everyday life of need. For them, the aftermath meant queuing for a piece of bread, collecting firewood in the ruins, searching for missing relatives. The reverberations also meant living with memories that were almost unbearable. The screams from the basements, the fear of bombs, the loss of loved ones. But despite all the suffering, the city still carried the seeds of a new beginning during this time. Survival itself was an act of hope. Every child that made it through, every family that managed to find a new home, every piece of bread that was shared was a step towards the future. Precisely because it was so destroyed, Berlin became a place where the never again could be formulated particularly forcefully. Thus, after 1945, Berlin not only remained the capital of defeat, but over the years developed into a city of new beginnings. But in May 1945, it was one thing above all: the symbol of doom. It embodied the total defeat of an ideology that wanted to dominate the world and was sinking in its own center. It stood for the price of the war, for the victims, and for the abyss into which Germany and Europe had been plunged. The reverberations of the Battle of Berlin resonated far beyond the city. It was a global symbol of the end of the Second World War in Europe, a symbol of destruction, but also of the possibility of creating a new world out of the rubble. Berlin was the heart that was broken, and at the same time, the place where life slowly stirred again. Thus, the Battle of Berlin was not only the military end of the war, but also the beginning of a new epoch in which the city was to play a prominent role as a symbol of decline and later reconstruction.